I think to be a believer in modern times is quite difficult. It's very challenging, really. In my youth, one followed the beliefs, as it were, the traditions of one's parents and elders. I don't think that's the case today. I was quite secure in my beliefs, in my religious beliefs. We just followed what was traditional in the family. And we lived a fairly placid kind of life. We thought we had all the answers then. If we didn't have them at 18, we assumed we'd have them by the time we're 25. So we sat back and relaxed. All things would come in due time. Today it's quite different. It's much more difficult to be a believer today. And the scenario for young people is much different also. It's characterized much more by change and volatility. Great instability. One begins to doubt not just one's beliefs, but one's whole value system. I think that makes life a bit more difficult to live, and choices more difficult to make also. Because what's being challenged is not just one belief system, but also the social values you live by and society in which you live. For some 2,000 years, Christianity was the dominant philosophy and religion of the era. We took part in that quite happily. In my day, I was quite secure in the knowledge I followed the same religion most other people did also. The values I held, most other people held at the same time. That was a great consolation without even being aware of the fact. In my day, Christianity was, as it were, the dominant feature of our society. One didn't have to look too far to see where one stood on most matters. I think that the stability I had in my youth doesn't exist anymore. The sense of belonging to a church or a family was so much a part of my life that I took it for granted. Today it's quite different, really. It's very difficult for the younger people to find their value system and even where they stand as regards today, let alone tomorrow. Eugene de Mazenod was a young man aged about 25 who was a refugee, a noble living in Italy of French descent, and he came back to France eventually around the age 25. And when he came back, he was absolutely struck by the destruction he saw around him. Society had fallen apart. The French Revolution had made a vast change to the lives of the people. They lived in misery and poverty, and the wars following on the actual revolution were forever drawing people away from their homes and their villages and their society. He looked around for a while. He was caught in a family that was falling apart. His parents were bitterly divided and divorced. He wasn't sure where he stood or what he believed in for a time, and he gradually began to develop a greater sense of what he believed in and the faith he had. Nothing says from his adolescence that he got a huge religious spirit, but he had a vision of what he could do for France and the people of France. He was really moved by the poverty and the misery he saw, and he decided to do something as best he could to build up his nation and his people, and the young people in particular. And so, what he did was, he got some friends together, and he began a small group of people whom he called oblates. And his plan was to try and really build up the youth, the dispossessed, and the really poor from the word go. He began what we call the oblates in a small town in France, but gradually they developed and they outgrew where they began, and they went worldwide. He sent his followers to the tropics in Africa and Sri Lanka, to the snows of Canada and Alaska, and the world over really, all over Europe and that. His idea was to try and hand on the values of the gospel in such a way he would build up the most abandoned of all. His eye was on the poor, the really poor, the prisoners, the dispossessed, the young people, those with no hope for the future, and to give them a sense of their own value and their own worth, to make them aware of how important they were in the eyes of God and in the eyes of each other. Where the poor are, you're going to find the oblates. That's the bequest the Mazenod left to us. And where you find the oblates today, in parishes, in schools, in prisons, among the most abandoned, what you're really finding is the life and the spirit of the Mazenod. He began with the idea of making life better for those who had very little. And the plan today, 200 years later, is to take that spirit of generosity and compassion and kindness and spread it abroad, just as the Mazenod did many years ago. He is as relevant today in the needs of people as he was when he began as a young noble 200 years ago. If you find the poor and the needy, you should find the Mazenod and his oblates.